Namaskar. Well, friends, I heartily welcome you all to Bhim Bhashya, my audio video podcast series focused on Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. This audio video podcast series has 54 short speeches on Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of his multifaceted genius. Friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and above all, the grand vision that he had shown for the entire nation. That is what this podcast series is all about. So let's proceed. Well, friends, in the last 4 episodes, I have been talking about Dr. Ambedkar's role as the principal architect of the Indian Constitution. That is one role which is widely known and appreciated. In this episode and the next one, that is to say, episode 43 and episode 44, I am going to talk about the first draft of the Indian Constitution that was presented to the Constituent Assembly by Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. Let us start with the broad framework of the Indian Constitution as reflected in the first draft. You will recall that Dr. Ambedkar was elected to the Constituent Assembly first from Bengal on 19th July 1946, and later he was re-elected from the Bombay province in July 1947. He was appointed as the first law minister of the independent India in August 1947 and was entrusted with the enormous responsibility as the chairman of the drafting committee for the Indian Constitution. And that happened on August 29, August 30th of 1947. That's barely 15 days after the country became independent. This momentous phase in Dr. Ambedkar's career is characterized by phenomenal and path-breaking work which earned him the distinction as the principal architect of the Indian Constitution. What I'm going to present here is some parts of the historic presentation that was made by Dr. Ambedkar to the Constituent Assembly on 4th November 1948. That is to say, about 14 months after the drafting committee was formed and Dr. Ambedkar was made its chairman. And I'm going to reproduce this from the Constituent Assembly debates and express Dr. Ambedkar's thoughts in his own words. Dr. Ambedkar, in his speech, his presentation to the Constituent Assembly says, Mr. President, sir, I introduce the draft constitution as settled by the drafting committee and move that it be taken into consideration. The draft constitution, as it has emerged from the drafting committee, is a formidable document, said Dr. Ambedkar. It contains 315 articles and 8 schedules. It must be admitted that the constitution of no country could be found to be so bulky as the draft Indian Constitution. The draft constitution, Dr. Ambedkar said, has been before the public for 8 months. During this long time, friends, critics, and adversaries have had more than sufficient time to express their reactions to the provisions contained in it. He says, and I quote, "Let me draw your attention to the special features of Indian Constitution and also meet the criticism that has been leveled against it. Dr. Ambedkar goes on, and I quote him again, a student of constitutional law, if a copy of a constitution is placed in his hands, is sure to ask two questions. Firstly, what is the form of government that is envisaged in the constitution? And secondly, what is the form of the constitution? These are the two critical matters which every constitution has to deal with. I will begin with the first of the two questions. In the draft constitution, there is placed at the head of the Indian Union a functionary who is called the President of the Union. The title of this functionary reminds one of the President of the United States. But beyond the identity of names, there is absolutely nothing in common between the form of government prevalent in America and the form of government proposed under the draft constitution. The American form of government is called the presidential system of government. What the draft constitution proposes here is the parliamentary system. The two are fundamentally different. Under the presidential system of America, the president is the chief head of the executive. The administration is vested in him. Under the draft constitution, the president occupies the same position as the king under the English constitution. He is the head of the state, but not of the executive. He represents the nation, but he does not rule the nation. He is the symbol of nation. His place in the administration is that of a ceremonial device on a seal by which the nation's decisions are made known. Under the American Constitution, the president has under him secretaries in charge of different departments. In like manner, the President of the Indian Union will have under him ministers in charge of different departments of administration. Here again, there is a fundamental difference between the two. The President of the United States is not bound to accept any advice tendered to him by any one of his secretaries. The President of the Indian Union will be generally bound by the advice of his ministers. He can do nothing contrary to their advice, nor can he do anything without their advice. The President of the United States can dismiss any secretary at any time. The President of Indian Union has no power to do so, so long as his ministers command a majority in the parliament. The presidential system of America is based upon the separation of the executive and the legislature, so that the president and his secretaries cannot be the members of the Congress. The draft constitution does not recognize this doctrine. The ministers under the Indian Union are members of the parliament. Only members of parliament can become ministers. Ministers have the same rights as the members of parliament. Namely, they can sit in the parliament, take part in the debate, and vote in its proceedings. Both systems of government are, of course, democratic, and the choice between the two is not very easy. A democratic executive must satisfy two conditions. First, it must be stable executive. Two, it must be a responsible executive. Unfortunately, it has not been possible so far to devise a system which can ensure both in equal degree. You can have a system which can give you more stability but less responsibility. Or you can have a system which can give you more responsibility but less stability. American system gives more stability. The British system, on the other hand, gives more responsibility but less stability. The reason for this is obvious. The American executive is a non-parliamentarian executive, which means that it is not dependent upon the majority in the parliament. Being a non-parliamentary executive, the Congress of the United States cannot dismiss the executive. A parliamentary government must resign the moment it loses the confidence of the majority of the members of parliament. Looking at it from the point of view of responsibility, a non-parliamentary executive being independent of the parliament tends to be less responsible to the legislature, while a parliamentary executive being more dependent on the majority in the parliament becomes more responsible. The parliamentary system differs from a non-parliamentary system in as much as the former is more responsible than the latter, but they also differ as to the time and agency for assessment of their responsibility. Unquote. Dr. Ambedkar goes on, and I quote him again, the draft constitution, in recommending the parliamentary system of executive, has preferred more responsibility to more stability. So far, I have explained the form of the government under the draft constitution. I will now turn to the other question, says Dr. Ambedkar, namely the form of the constitution. Two principal forms of the constitution are known to history. One is called unitary and the other one is called federal. The two essential characteristics of a unitary constitution are, first, the supremacy of the federal polity, and two, the absence of subsidiary sovereign polities. Contrariwise, a federal constitution is marked by, one, existence of a central polity and subsidiary polities side by side, and two, by each being sovereign in the field assigned to it. In other words, a federation means establishment of a dual polity. This dual polity under the proposed constitution will consist of the union at the center and the states at the periphery, each endowed with sovereign powers to be exercised in the field assigned to them, respectively, by the Constitution. This dual polity resembles the American Constitution. Under the American Constitution, the federal government is not a mere league of states, nor are the states administrative units or agencies of the federal government. In the same way, the Indian Constitution proposed in the draft Constitution is not a league of states, nor are the states administrative units or agencies of the union government. Here, however, the similarities between the Indian and the American Constitution come to an end. The differences that distinguish them are more fundamental and glaring than the similarities between the two. The points of difference between the American Federation and the Indian Federation are mainly two. In the United States, there is A, citizenship of the USA, but there is also a citizenship of the state. There are a number of rights that a state can grant to its own citizens or residents that it may and does legally deny to non-residents or grant to non-residents only on more difficult terms than those imposed on its residents. Going away from Dr. Ambedkar's presentation, let me give you an example. In the universities in the United States, the fees paid by American citizens are distinguished between those who are coming from the state and those who are coming from outside the state. Typically, for a university in America, for any student who belongs to that state, he pays much lower fees, which are called in-state fees, whereas American citizens from other states, if they come to these universities in a particular state, they will have to pay higher fees. This is just an example, elucidation of the difference. Going back again to Dr. Ambedkar's presentation, let me say that the advantages given to the citizens in his own state constitute special rights of state citizenship. Taken all together, they amount to a considerable difference in rights between the citizens and non-citizens of the state. The proposed Indian Constitution is a dual polity with a single citizenship. This is a very important point that Dr. Ambedkar is making, and I reiterate, the proposed Indian Constitution is a dual polity with a single citizenship. There is only one citizenship for the whole country. It is Indian citizenship. There is no state citizenship. Every Indian has the same rights of citizenship no matter in what state he resides. Distinct they are, but how distinct are the state governments in the United States from the federal government? Some idea of this distinctness may be obtained from the following facts, says Dr. Ambedkar. 1. Subject to the maintenance of the republican form of the government, each state in America is free to make its own constitution. 2. The people of a state retain forever in their hands, altogether independent of the national government, the power of altering their constitution. This is a huge difference between the Indian system. Dr. Ambedkar says, and I quote him again, "This is not true of the proposed Indian Constitution. No state has a right to frame its own constitution. The Constitution of the Union and of the states is a single frame from which neither can get out and within which they must work." There are other features of the proposed Indian Federation which mark it off not only from the Indian Federation but from all other federations. All federal systems, including the American, are placed in the right mold of federalism. No matter what the circumstances, it cannot change its form and shape. It can never become unitary. Dr. Ambedkar says, on the other hand, the draft constitution can be both unitary as well as federal according to the requirements of time and circumstances. In normal times, it is framed to work as a federal system, but in times of war, it is so designed as to make it work as though it was a unitary system. Once the president issues a proclamation, which he is authorized to do under the provisions of Article 352, the whole scene can be transformed and the nation becomes a unitary state. The union under the proclamation can claim, if it wants, 1. The power to legislate upon any subject, even though it may be in the state list. 2. Power to give direction to the states as to how they should exercise their executive authority in the matters which are within their charge. 3. The power to vest authority for any purpose in any officer. And 4. The power to suspend the financial provisions of the Constitution. Dr. Ambedkar says that there are two weaknesses from which federation is alleged to suffer. That these faults are inherent in the federalism. There can be no dispute. A federal constitution cannot be but a written constitution, and a written constitution must necessarily be a rigid constitution. A federal constitution means division of sovereignty by no less a sanction than that of the law of the constitution between the federal government and the states. In assuaging the rigor of rigidity and legalism, the draft constitution has a long list of subjects for the concurrent powers of legislation. Under the draft constitution, there are as many as 37. There are as many as 6 articles in the draft constitution where the provisions are of a temporary duration and which could be replaced by Parliament at any time by provision suitable for the occasion. The biggest advance made by the draft constitution is in the matter of executive powers of legislation vested in Parliament. The exclusive authority of the Indian Parliament, as proposed in the draft constitution, will extend to 91 matters. In this way, the draft constitution has secured the greatest possible elasticity in its federalism, which is supposed to be rigid by its nature. Dr. Ambedkar says, what is to be noted is that it has added new ways of overcoming the rigidity and legalism inherent in federalism, which are special to it and which are not found anywhere else. First is the power given to Parliament to legislate on exclusively provincial matters in normal times. The second, means adopted to avoid rigidity and legalism, is the provision of facility with which the Constitution could be amended. One can therefore safely say that the Indian Federation will not suffer from the faults or rigidity or legalism. It is distinguishing feature that it is a flexible federation. Dr. Ambedkar adds, there is another special feature of the proposed Indian Federation which distinguishes it from other federations. The draft constitution had sought to forge means and methods whereby India will have a federation and at the same time will have uniformity in all basic matters which are essential to maintain the unity of the country. The means adopted by the draft constitution here are 3. First, a single judiciary. 2, uniformity in fundamental laws, civil and criminal. And 3, a common all India civil service to man important posts. Dr. Ambedkar goes on to say, and I quote again, in the United States, the federal judiciary and the state judiciary are separate and independent of each other. The Indian Federation, though a dual polity, has no dual judiciary at all. The High Courts and the Supreme Court form one and single integrated judiciary. care is taken to eliminate all diversity from laws which are at the basic of civic and corporate life. This is what Dr. Ambedkar is saying, is followed in all federations by a dual service. In all federations, there is a federal civil service and then there is a state civil service. The Indian Federation, though a dual polity, will have a dual service, but with one exception. The Constitution provides that without depriving the states of their right to form their own civil service, there shall be an all India civil service recruited on an all India basis with common qualifications, with uniform scale of pay, and the members of which alone could be appointed to those strategic posts throughout the Union. Such are the special features of the proposed federation. In sum, what Dr. Ambedkar does in this part is to give the Constituent Assembly a complete view of the basic structure of the proposed constitution. Such are the special features of the proposed federation. There are other part, very important part, where Dr. Ambedkar responds to all the objections which were taken by the Constituent Assembly members, but that we will take up in the next episode, that is episode 44. So let's conclude this session here. But before I go, let me say this, that if you like this audio-visual podcast series, Bhim Bhashya, please like it, please share it, and please subscribe to it. So long until we meet again real soon. Thank you. Namaskar.